When I first made my video on the Kronstadt Revolt, a lot of the arguments and information had to be shelved for time and visual flow. Today being the anniversary of the crushing of the Kronstadt Revolt in 1921, I thought I might explain some of these further points by critiquing Finnish Bolshevik's notable assessment of the revolt. Oh, and by the way, don't expect any flashy graphics this time around. I'm pressed for time as it is, and my CPU has feelings too. This video is merely a supplementary rebuttal for the nerds. Now, to get a bit of the starting stuff out of the way, Finn talks about Yeltsin praising the revolt, framed in such a way I can only assume is meant as a poisoning the well tactic. Opportunist politicians canonize old figures and movements all the time in service of their cause. They omit, obscure, and distort unwanted elements and so on. In Yeltsin's case, this was simply a matter of demonizing his old Leninist opponents in the Duma. Next, the Mutiny newspaper report, which, as I've gone over, a report showcasing that the revolt happened 2 weeks prior should be your tell that this is unreliable evidence. The memorandum by the Whites, whilst not proving a link to a conspiracy, does showcase that they knew that there was unrest in the fleet, something that maybe the Soviets ought to have known. I would then only assume that the press did what they do best and embellish a little. Finnbol has no issue listing a large amount of exaggerated reports by the Western press during the actual uprising, but doesn't seem to consider whether the propaganda of this report was not an opportune post hoc move by the Bolsheviks. As for Petrochenko's desire to join the Whites, the source from this comes from a single reference in the New York Times article. There's no background given besides circumstantial motivation due to the squalid conditions he and his family were in, that were causing immense struggle for the working masses. In such a situation, who knows what we might do? In the same clipping, he also refers to the Whites as reactionary, so clearly he still harbors some opposition. I'm sure that plenty of Bolsheviks may have had questionable actions and histories prior to them becoming Bolsheviks. I mean, some MLs like to do this with Trotsky, claiming that he never was a communist in the first place. However, the issue that Finnbol makes, which will become more apparent, is that pushing so much of the attention behind the entire fleet towards a single person is not a good representation, especially since it was an elected 15-man commission from a larger elected delegation. You don't like it when people go Stalin, Stalin, Stalin when it was bigger than simply him, so perhaps don't do the same here. Alright, let's get on with it.
In 1921, Russia was in ruins after years of World War I and Civil War. Fuel and food were always extremely scarce. As long as the Civil War lasted, the population basically understood and tolerated all these hardships.
Peasants did not just put up with the Soviet measures as is inferred here. The actions resulted in many of them refusing to cooperate. And many times they actually reduced their production effort down to the bare means, because there was no point in them producing any more if it's just going to be taken away. And the surge of peasant revolts after the war only appears to have showcased this long frustration. Still, it was of course a war, so one can understand the Bolshevik perspective. But that then becomes a question of state legitimacy, and that's far too much for right now. Nevertheless, they were not simply idle actors, willing to put up with shit. They did try their best to resist requisitioning.
There was unrest in Petrograd after several factories were closed down due to fuel shortages. False rumors of workers being shot and factories even being bombed in Petrograd were spread in the fortress town of Kronstadt.
Bear in mind, during all of these shortages, the government were purposefully trying to stop the black market, a vital lifeline for many considering the circumstances. Whilst the rationing was indeed the start of the strike, saying that that was all that it was about is like saying that the coffee crisis in East Germany was just about coffee. We should know full well that discontent is often larger than it first might appear. Let's see what the peasants were also saying. Angry workmen call for the immediate scrapping of war communism in favor of a system of free labor. So assertive was this demand that the government sent emissaries to the factories to try and justify its policies. Workers took to the streets with banners and placards demanding free trade, higher rations, and the abolition of grain requisitions. Nor did they stop at economic demands. Some of the demonstrators appealed to the restoration of political rights and civil liberties. And here and there, a placard even called for the revival of the Constituent Assembly. For transparency, there were also some not-so-nice remarks made, but the point is that these grievances clearly demonstrate the discontent was much larger than what the authorities claimed. This is also corroborated in Simon Pirani's research. Not only this, but the effects of Kronstadt would lead the Bolsheviks to postponing and even heavily controlling future elections in fear that it would delegitimize their standing. And to this latter point that the rebels were inspired to revolt simply because of these rumors, no. If you read on just a single page ahead, Avrich states that they sent out a delegation into Petrograd and came back with the discovery of a heavily militarized situation, which led to the inception of the charter. Finn appears to have a habit of being a tad bit selective, as is shown in his next point, where he continues this rumors line.
And, quote, "The Petrograd strikes were on the wane, but the rumors of shootings and full-scale rioting had already aroused the sailors, and on March 2nd, at a time when the disturbances had all but ceased, they were drafting the erroneous announcement for publication the following day that the city was in the throes of a general insurrection."
I take great issue with your use of this ellipse here. The full reading of Avrich's words reveals some much-needed information. It was true, moreover, that the Petrograd strikes were on the wane, having reached a peak on the last day of February. That's 1 or 2 days of difference between which Avrich states the peak of the strikes which the delegation saw versus when the document had been written. So with that information, it's understandable to think that the committee, which had been holed up on the island for some time, might have figured that the city was still on fire. I can excuse the leaving out of immediate previous or following texts from time to time. Unfortunately, Finn does this neglection on no less than 12 occasions, including this next one.
A mass meeting was held in Kronstadt on March 1st, where anti-communist statements and lies were spread. The meeting was orchestrated in such a way that communists were not allowed to speak. The topic was raised that new elections to the Soviet should be carried out. A delegate meeting of soldiers was held the next day on March 2nd. In this meeting it was proposed that all communists should be arrested. The delegates were amazed.
Finnbol ends it there, but once more, some information is missing. Here is the original mention by Avrich, containing again some crucial context. This was a minority of people. The majority of the delegation did not want to do this, and instead adhered to their principles.
However, the organizers of the mutiny made the completely baseless and hysterical claim that armed communist detachments were about to surround the meeting and arrest everyone. Therefore, it was supposedly justified and necessary to immediately, quickly begin rounding up and arresting all the communists. Quickly arrest them, they're coming to get us. This type of fear propaganda was cleverly used by the mutineers. Delegates had no time to think, they had no access to information, and communists had no chance to speak.
Leaving the conversation there leads the viewers to the conclusion that this was a coup attempt and that they took part through conspiracy. Once more, he does not go on to read the rest of Avrich's research, which states that at the time there were valid reasons to believe that an imminent attack was about to occur. Utterly baseless. I have always seen throughout Soviet apologia the use of, well, they were frightened, they were paranoid, they were surrounded on all sides, etc., etc., to justify the actions they took. In fact, such an argument was made to justify Kronstadt's crushing. It's fairly clear from the sources here that the rumors were started from a genuine sense of fear, as opposed to any intentional conspiracy. To see Finnbol taking a different standard to present this as utterly baseless when it comes to his enemies just feels to me like an example of pearl clutching. There's also the omission of a very crucial event which might give context to the arrests of the communists. The previous day, a 30-man delegation had been sent out to Petrograd to advertise their demands and program, and upon their discovery they were promptly arrested and whose fate remains a mystery to this day. Again, what's the comparison here?
The Bolshevik commissar barely had time to object to the irregular proceedings before being cut off by the so-called military specialist in charge of artillery, former Tsarist general named Kozlovsky. "Your time is past," Kozlovsky declared.
It's true that they did speak over him. Once more, however, is conveniently left out the actions just the day prior by Kalinin and Kuzmin, who had been sent out to negotiate with the fleet, but in doing so, just ended up insulting and threatening the sailors. So you can imagine that tensions and fears might be quite high. After the topic of summary executions in the north had been raised, Kuzmin announced that the working people have always shot traitors to the cause, and they will continue to shoot them in the future. In my place, we would have shot every 5th man, not every 10th, and that the Petropavlovsk resolution was a counter-revolutionary document, shouting that indiscipline and treason would be smashed by the iron hand of the proletariat. So with this context then, old man going, "Your time is past," and general dismissive attitudes the day after said people have acted in a highly defiant, belligerent, and unyielding manner, and implied that they'd kill you if they got the chance, might make it seem a little bit more understandable. And the same goes for rushing the meeting after a feared attack.
Introduction to the collection of primary source documents called Kronstadt Tragedy states, quote, "The chair of the meeting, Petrichenko, quieting down the meeting, announced that the Revolutionary Committee declares all communists present are to be seized and not to be released until the situation is clarified."
FinnBol is here referencing a commonly referred to smoking gun article from the International Communist League 4th International in their Spartacus newspaper from 2006. Which used primary sources from recently uncovered documents from the archives in 1999. I came across this report myself around 2018, and Finn appears to have based a good degree of his video on just this document. Now, I happen to know where you can find these primary sources, but this archive is notoriously difficult by the fact that it's all in Cyrillic, and the search engine is much to be desired. You can have a go at translating keywords all you want, but it never really pans out the way you want it to in a work of over 1,400 pages. In a prime example of a dick move, the ICL provides 0 page numbers in their document, which makes this whole thing even harder to figure out because we non-Russian speakers now need to trust the words of the old man's group. As I've shown, FinnBol has been very selective with his ellipsis and leaving out crucial conclusions. I can only imagine that the ICL have done similarly. A very important thing that the ICL leave out of their report is that one of the main white agents, George Elfengren, whose document they cite, by the way, admitted after the revolt that despite there being organizations in and around Petrograd that were wanting to usurp the Bolsheviks, that the events that took place in Petrograd and Kronstadt were not the actions of the above-mentioned organizations and occurred spontaneously against their will. As regards to the arrests, I am going to put Petrichenko's take on the accounts for transparency, although of course he's likely to be biased. I am willing to admit that the Presidium acted in an opportunistic manner in this scenario with the arrest of the communists. But as we've gone over, there was ample reason to believe this. And for the record, the Bolsheviks themselves have been none too privy to using surrounding events to push forward control of the Soviets. But of course, that's not opportunistic, that's just revolutionary necessity.
Using skillful propaganda and deception, Petrichenko claimed that the Provisional Committee was elected by soldier delegates. However, this was simply a lie. No election of such a kind had ever taken place. But the masses didn't know that. After all, maybe their delegates in their meeting had elected such a committee. Who could say? This is a good example of how this type of reactionary coup can happen.
I find Finn's use of words here a little bit strange. They seem to be in the realm of speculation to create doubt. But once more, Finn decides to forget about the fact that the committee was elected. Of the initial 5, the conference of 303 elected delegates promptly elected a 5-man presidium. This presidium took duties for the next 2 days due to the panic, but it didn't just stay like that, as is being inferred from Finn's omissions. On the evening of March 4th, some 200 delegates from Kronstadt's factories and military units gathered after work at the Garrison Club and, amid cries of victory or death, elected an enlarged revolutionary committee of 15 members. They would then later have meetings on the 8th and 11th. Now, Finn moves on to the makeup of the committee.
2 members of this committee were Mensheviks, who had opposed the October Revolution. Mensheviks and their foreign supporters believed that Russia needed capitalism and that Russia wasn't ready for a workers' revolution. Therefore, the workers' revolution needs to be defeated and capitalism needs to be restored. Ivan Oreshin, another member in the committee, was part of the capitalist Cadet Party, one of the leading parties under the Tsar.
Firstly, as you'll know, the Mensheviks were not a monolith, and within them contained numerous different allegiances and strategies. I know that you're an ML and you've got to hate them, but please, what happened for this constant call for nuance? Secondly, the Russian Revolution was a time of enormous political enlightenment and fluidity. It was very common for someone to move around a lot between parties and allegiances. So just saying that they used to do this or they used to do that isn't wholly damning of someone's political intentions. Trotsky, for example, was a former Menshevik, and I know you love him. Now to the representation of the people on this list. The article only mentions 3 members. This still leaves 12 members, the majority. The makeup of the revolt was mixed. Largely speaking, it was, as I've heard being referred to, as politically pluralist. That's what happens when you get a spontaneous revolution. Finn will later do the same with the financial and class backgrounds of some of the committee. Once more, Finn knows full well that Avrich includes a crucial preamble to this account. As you can see, most of the committee that we have information on were of what you might call a salt-of-the-earth background, not of bougie character. Now, I am willing to concede for future reference that some of the committee did not have their minds in the right places, and in light of that, they should be condemned. I do, however, see a lot of selective vigor going on surrounding whether the views of the leadership are so pertinent. I'd wager right now that you can think of many examples where the leadership of a group are not necessarily perfect, fine, distinguished young gentlemen, and yet no matter what mud someone might sling at them, you would always defend them. Why might that be? That's rhetorical, by the way. Just for comparison, I thought it might be quite funny to have a look at some of the reports on how the Bolshevik elites themselves were living during this period of severe hardship. 5,000 Bolsheviks and their families lived in the Kremlin and in special party hotels such as the National and the Metropole in the center of Moscow. The Kremlin's domestic quarters had over 2,000 service staff and its own complex of shops, including a hairdresser and a sauna, a hospital and a nursery, and 3 vast restaurants with cooks trained in France. Its domestic budget in 1920, when all of these services were declared free, was higher than what was spent on social welfare in the entire of Moscow. In Petrograd, the top party bosses lived in the Astoria Hotel, recently restored to its former splendor after the devastations of the revolution as the first house of the Soviets. From their suites, they could call for room service from the comrade waiters, who were taught to click their heels and call them comrade master. Long-forgotten luxuries such as champagne, caviar, perfume, toothbrushes were supplied in abundance. The hotel was sealed to the public by a gang of burly guards in black leather jackets. In the evening, government cars were lined up by the entrance waiting to take the elite residents off to the opera or to the Smolny for a banquet. Grishna Zinoviev, the boss of Petrograd, often came and went with his Chekist bodyguards and a string of assorted prostitutes. The top party leaders had their own landed estates, requisitioned from the Tsarist elite. There were dozens of estates dotted around the capital, which the Soviet executive turned over to the party leaders for their own private use. Each of them had their own vast retinue of servants, as in the old days. By all means confiscate the homes of the elite. That doesn't mean that you have to emulate them. I am aware that Figure's reputation as a so-called bougie historian might discredit him, but it's really not too hard to believe a lot of this. The Soviets still maintained a form of wage labor after all, and Emma herself gives a first-hand account from the Astoria and National hotels. Point is, it's a bit tight to bring up former capitalists being in the fleet when the Bolsheviks themselves were living in pretty good standing with a huge labor force underneath just their cadre, and ever more when you consider the plight of the ordinary people at this time. We've gone over Petrochenko's reasonings. Maybe the Bolsheviks made a mistake here.
So already from its very inception, the Kronstadt Mutiny was basically counter-revolutionary.
You need to stop using the term counter-revolutionary so much. It is a very relative term. What you're basically saying is they're opposing us. And that's all going to be relative down to whose allegiance you respond to. What if somebody held that the Bolsheviks themselves were the counter-revolutionaries, that they might have nominally been the most advanced communists? Yet in their actions they at innumerable points put down avenues for worker control and were incentivized far more towards party centralization. Evidence towards them acting in a non-worker aligned way, by the way, is explained to great effect by Nojrance's video on this topic, and I happen to know that you love his work. And for comparison, also bear in mind all of these points raised when it comes to the accusations regarding how the sailors acted.
The mutiny leaders needed to gauge the mood of the soldiers and try to fool them. Leader of the mutiny, would-be White Guardist Petrochenko, made the proposal to allow full freedom for quote-unquote all socialist parties in the public meeting of March 1st. Immediately he was attacked by angry shouts by soldiers, quote, "That's freedom for the right SRs and Mensheviks. No, no way." The cadet Ivan Oreshin, who was also part of the PRC, wrote, quote, "The Kronstadt uprising broke out under the pretext of replacing the old Soviet with a new one. The question of extending the vote also to the bourgeoisie was carefully avoided by the orators. They did not want to evoke opposition among the insurgents."
What Petrochenko is doing here is simply listing proposals for the resolution. This one in particular is simply an account by Kuzmin. There were clearly other proposals listed too, which upon acceptance and rejection then came together to form the resolution, which a few hours later was then passed in the presence of 16,000 sailors. It's a bit of a reach to claim that engaging in policy proposals is a malicious act. How else are you going to do it? With regards to Oreshin's statement, this is indeed an interesting admission. Though oddly absent are any other corroborating accounts from any of the other sailors or any of the other committee members who were captured, which might have been useful in their situation, and we'll get to them later. Like we've said, most of the committee were not of a bourgeois persuasion. The claims from Oreshin do, however, in addition to the comments regarding the SRs and the Mensheviks, the independent spirit and traditional hatred of officers, the booing of the Bolsheviks, and the fact that the fleet turned away SR leader Viktor Chernov's crucial offer of food and supplies, appear to showcase a certain character to the fleet as a whole. Contrary to the claims of them being exacerbated peasants or of petty bourgeois aspiration that pro-Bolsheviks often like to portray them as. And that they did indeed represent a powerful and enthusiastic rank and file, one of which was not to be reckoned with, and one that is certainly not in support of the Bolsheviks.
It was still completely obvious that the Kronstadt mutineers were not following anarchist theory in any typical sense. They were not establishing a stateless society, but an anti-communist military dictatorship.
What is failed to be referenced at this point is that the military dictatorship line comes from after the revolt had failed, by some of those who survived. I'll discuss this point later, but just for the record, I really want to hammer home just how unlikely a white resurgence was. Despite demobilization, the Red Army still had millions of soldiers left to fight. The whites, by comparison, were decimated. At most, 70,000 available who had virtually zero will left to fight anymore, all scattered and disorientated across the Black Sea region, which is thousands of miles from Petrograd, by the way. At this point, Finland had declared peace. No imperial power had the will or determination to engage, hence them largely playing a passive role during the war and leaving the year prior. The only threat that remained was of an internal matter, and the strike wave in Petrograd was interested in reform, not in revolution. I know that you see these reports, but they're largely just the result of hopeful generals, wannabe rulers, and die-hard devotees. It would be the equivalent of Germany in April 1945 thinking that they could somehow mount a counterattack. The Nazis, as we know, were always clinging on to the faint possibility of some miracle, right to the point of their surrender. And by the way, I'd just like to make an educated guess here. We're seeing a lot of references in these works about Kronstadt regarding communists. It is most probable from the way in which they are referring to them that this is simply being used as a replacement for Bolshevik. Capital C communist at this time was a relatively new thing. All parties historically tended to refer to themselves as socialist or social democratic. The Seventh Party Congress officially referred to their party as the Communist Party instead of just the Bolsheviks, effectively the first in nearly 70 years. So this is to say that denouncing communists might not have been an indictment of all socialist ideas, rather the party.
And there was even a plan to carry out a mass killing. Kronstadt 1921 states, quote, "Early on the morning of March 18th, Shustov set up a machine gun outside the cell which contained 23 prisoners. He was prevented from slaughtering the communists only by the advance of the Red Army across the ice."
This Shustov account is coming solely from the words of Kuzmin, and I've reason to believe that there's a fair bit of embellishment going on here. Nowhere in his testimony, for example, does he talk about escalating the situation with his threats and insults to the fleet, and he tries his best to present himself in a very good light. And according to Victor Serge, the anarchist who turned Bolshevik and then eventually got purged, the press definitely did their fair bit of embellishing. The Leningrad Pravda stated that Kuzmin had been brutally handled during his captivity at Kronstadt, and that he had only just escaped summary execution, which had been ordered for him in writing by the Counter-revolutionaries. He then went to Kuzmin, who gave him a somewhat different account. "I can scarcely believe that they wanted to shoot you. Did you really see the order?" He hesitated, in some embarrassment. "Oh, you always get these exaggerations. There was some little sheet written in threatening terms. In short, he had a warm time of it, nothing more." For comparison here, this is an allegation in which 23 of the 300 who were imprisoned were going to be killed by the will of a single perpetrator right at the very end, when the revolt had basically failed and they were running on empty. Now let's compare that with the actions of the Bolsheviks when the revolt started. After the first wave of revolts, the authorities responded by taking hostages and warning that any harm to the communists would have grave consequences. The prisoners themselves, by their own testimony, lived in constant fear of being shot. The authorities, for their part, had executed 45 seamen at Oranienbaum and taken the relatives of the Kronstadters hostage. But all of this pearl-clutching is very rich, coming from Finnish Bolshevik, seeing as the man is a very visible enjoyer of Grover fur, having made a 34-video playlist on him, which leads me to the conclusion that he probably supports or denies the Katyn massacre. He's fine defending that, yet he eggs on anarchists for this relatively minute individual action that didn't happen and whose veracity is unclear. With the exception of swapping their boots for sandals, the treatment of the hostages by the fleet was found to be of relative goodwill. They had no reason to do so. They were their shipmates.
Lenin pointed out that the Kronstadt demands were quite vague and unclear, and this was inevitable because they were not realistic policy proposals, but a combination of utopianism, spontaneity, and demagogic propaganda intended to gather enough support until the White Guard could take power and crush the communists and all other opposition.
The point of a negotiation is you negotiate. The demands weren't that vague, certainly more specific than anything Occupy Wall Street ever put out. But even if they were, you figure it out with those making the demands, and then you come to a conclusion, just like any strike. And maybe you can't agree on all of them, but you can at least try. The sailors initially were only interested in reforming the system, not overthrowing it. It might have been a better idea if Finnbol actually listed the demands, as he does a pretty bad job summarizing them. Finnbol claims that they wanted to allow anti-Bolshevik parties. I mean, yes, that's an ideological game. Imagine a world where the Bolsheviks are banned, and then you say, "We want Bolshevik parties to run." Then I say, "No, you guys want to kill us," which you literally are and will do. Why does Finnbol list this one as more rations for us? The demands, as he then states, wanted to equalize the rations, not give more. He defends this unequal distribution of rations by the Bolsheviks by stating that they had to give bigger rations to the ex-bourgeoisie and party members because if not, they would defect. These sorts of justifications are the reason why it's very hard to engage with ML defenses because they always invite larger ideological questions, such as the very premise of seizing state power in the first place, meaning that now you have to supervise the entire apparatus and all the bureaucratical bullshit that goes along with it, to which people end up becoming cogs in a machine. But I'll get to that bit in my conclusion. Interestingly, the rebels did manage to walk the walk and equalize rationing during their revolt.
Former imperial officers were used as military specialists under the watchful supervision of political commissars. In this way, badly needed command experience and technical knowledge were provided until a new corps of Red commanders could be trained. The Kronstadt mutineers demanded that this system be abolished. One can only imagine what the results would have been. The non-communist officers inside the Red Army would no longer follow socialist instructions, and the Red Army would basically stop being a proletarian army at all.
Once more, Finnbol ignores the reasoning behind getting rid of the commissars. They wanted these to be elected by the sailors, instead of instructed head down from the party, which is showcased in section 10 of the proposal. Their discontent appears to have been driven by something far larger and different than a desire to get back to Tsarism. Perhaps they had their own personal annoyances with the commissars which have been going on for years. So clearly very different from the pearl clutch of, "They wanted to abolish commissars. This means that the white officers would have immediately been freed." That's just assuming the absolute worst possibility, of which has very little space in reality. Now, talking about those so-called white officers.
According to the SRs, the White Guard General Kozlovsky was elected to the Defense Council of the Kronstadt Mutiny, but it seems unlikely that a White Guard General could have gotten elected to such a position. It's more likely that he was simply chosen to the position by the mutiny leaders.
I'm not really sure what to make of his words here. Why is Finnbol repeatedly referring to Kozlovsky as a white general? Kozlovsky was a Tsarist general, who then defected to the Bolsheviks and was appointed by Trotsky to serve in the Red Army. In 1920, he was awarded a watch for courage and feat of arms in the battle against Yudenich, an actual white general. Finn explains that the Bolshevik recruitment of Tsarist generals was permissible because they needed people with expertise, but recruiting white generals, not so much. I can only speculate that Finn is trying his darndest to say that Kozlovsky was a white general so he can justify this claim. But it's just not true. He was an advisor in the Red Army for 4 years. Serge recounts in his diary that even prior to the full-blown revolt on March 2nd, the Bolsheviks were still pressing lies about Kozlovsky leading the revolt. What's terrible then is that Finn isn't just pulling this argument out of his arse, which would undoubtedly be better, because this is the exact thing which MLs are accused of but keep on denying, upholding an obvious party propaganda lie. Serge goes on from this. Small posters stuck on the walls of the still empty streets proclaimed that the counter-revolutionary General Kozlovsky had seized Kronstadt through conspiracy and treason. The proletariat was summoned to arms. But even before I went to the district committee, I met comrades rushing out with their revolvers who told me that this was an atrocious lie. The sailors had mutinied. It was a naval revolt led by the Soviets. The worst of it all is that we were paralyzed by official falsehoods. It had never before happened that our party should lie to us like this. It's necessary for the benefit of the public, some said, who were nonetheless horror-stricken by it all. I am also a little bit peeved by the way that Finn appears to sneak in little embellishments when he can, like stating,
And the old Tsarist officers, like General Kozlovsky, Vilken, and some other, were soon walking around like they were all of a sudden masters of the situation.
who, what, when. This isn't general information. It just seems like an attempt to subtly throw in seeds of doubt about the situation. No evidence is shown as to Kozlovsky being the head of the revolt as Finn claims here. And Finn would later go on to make this point about Kozlovsky wanting to destroy the ice, or assault Oranienbaum, but that the political leaders would not allow him to do so, which if anything is an admission right there that would argue that Kozlovsky was not in a powerful position. The masters of the situation. MLs love to go on about how Alexander Berkman made the erroneous claim that Kozlovsky wasn't even at Kronstadt. Now, perhaps you'd like to make a comment on the constantly made Bolshevik lies that he was the leader of the revolt, even prior to the revolt even starting, of which Victor Serge knew to be a falsehood. One last point, in a little comment exchange Finn did below, he even claims that Avrich states that Kozlovsky was in charge of the mutiny. I mean, no. Just no.
Food and money also came from rich capitalists and white emigres to support the Kronstadt mutineers. These food supplies were then later delivered to Kronstadt from Finland with the collaboration of the Finnish Secret Service. Avrich basically confirms all these facts. He writes, quote, "The Russian Union of Commerce and Industry in Paris declared its intention to send food and other supplies to Kronstadt. An initial sum of 2 million Finnish marks had already been pledged to aid Kronstadt in, quote, the sacred cause of liberating Russia, unquote. And, quote, the Russian Asiatic Bank contributed 225,000 francs. Additional funds were donated by other Russian banks.
Finn lists hundreds and thousands of francs and large food supplies being sent to the fleet and states that Avrich confirms that they were delivered. He does not. Once more, he confirms that they intended to do this, but the claim that all of this reached Kronstadt, or that they even accepted it, is not mentioned here. The fleet was interesting in that far from accepting supplies from all walks of life, it denied many, as I hinted earlier. Throughout this video, there's this constant sort of confusion and conflation between reactionaries supporting the revolt and the views of the people themselves. It's quite slimy. It should go without saying that people offering money and supplies does not mean that the rebels themselves shared the same outlook as them. Avrich notes that the call was only done as a last resort after failing to secure support from the mainland. And if you read a little bit further back, Avrich showcases effectively the either apathy or lack of necessity on behalf of the powers to do so. Remember, they'd already left their intervention in Russia, they were not going to be keen to intervene anytime soon. Regardless of Avrich, from newer information we can ascertain a shipment may have been delivered, which was again made in desperation after the revolt failed to spread to the mainland. This is hardly a damning special relationship.
However, Petruchenko and his allies were simply using them and planned eventually to get rid of them too. Kupolov writes, quote, the PRC, seeing that Kronstadt was filling up with agents of a monarchist organization, issued a declaration that it would not enter into negotiations with, nor accept any aid from, any non-socialist parties. But Petruchenko and the general staff secretly worked in connection with the monarchists and prepared the ground for an overthrow of the committee, unquote.
Scant is actually corroboratively known about Kupolov, apart from that he went out with Vershinin to negotiate with the Bolsheviks. I've been unable to verify this source in the archives, but if I had to give it charity, I would probably say that this does appear to be more so speculation on Kupolov's behalf.
These are just completely insane lies. Capitalists, Mensheviks, and SRs constituted the majority of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee itself, especially the SRs.
That's an outright lie. He stated 2 Mensheviks and 1 cadet, that's Volk, Orishin, and Kilgast, and 2 capitalists, Baikov and Tukin. So that's 10 members unaccounted for, and where does this especially from the SRs come from? The best statement I can find is from the Soviet propaganda machine itself. I checked FinnBol's script, and interestingly, he's talking off script here. So for all I know, he just made this all up and hoped that we wouldn't notice. Now let's backtrack a few minutes.
The mutiny leader, Petrichenko, later in exile, stated, quote, "Cut off from the outside world, we could receive no aid from foreign sources even if we had wanted it. We served as agents of no external groups, neither capitalists, Mensheviks, nor SRs," unquote. And these are just completely insane lies. A sailor named Perepelkin, who was part of the Kronstadt mutiny, stated, quote, "And here I saw the former commander of the battleship Sevastopol, Baron Vilken, with whom I had earlier sailed, and it is he who is now acknowledged by the PRC to be a representative of the delegation that is offering us aid. I was outraged by this. I said, so that's the situation we're in. That's who we're forced to talk to."
I'm not exactly sure what this is supposed to prove. Petrichenko appears to be talking in a more all-encompassing context of being generally isolated. Again, I don't think a single delivery of food and medicine on the 16th of March near the end of the fighting would really batter this statement into the ground, but what do I know? Perepelkin corroborates this, however, not particularly paid much attention to is that this is an interrogation by the checker. Not just here, but in two other statements by FinnBol, he uses interrogation admissions as evidence towards the revolt being bad. Remember that Kupolov guy that we mentioned earlier? What I did find out about is that a year later he returned to Russia and was interrogated into giving information, of which he obliged, and eventually went on to become a checker informant. His intentions for doing so appear to be a good starting point for study. I don't think it's too much of a reach to say that an admission on behalf of police or military interrogation is probably not going to be the best source. We know full well that admissions can be forced out of somebody, or they might well make them up in order to potentially be relieved of their suffering, or to avoid execution. A victim of the Great Purge, Kozlovsky, who, funnily enough, was also responsible for crushing the revolt, is notable for writing up a confession which is splattered in his own blood. Just a little funny side point, I have actually come across MLs who state, "You can't prove that it's his blood." Yes, of course.
On March 17th, Petrichenko and the other leaders ordered the crews of ships Petropavlovsk and Sevastopol to blow up the ships and flee to anti-communist Finland. However, at this point the soldiers had basically had enough. They had begun to think that their leaders must be reactionaries. I mean, they had even seen the White Guard generals walking around, and they did not follow these orders. Instead, they rose up, they saved the ships, and arrested all the officers and provisional revolutionary committee members they could get their hands on. So, you could say that there was a mutiny against the mutiny.
A mutiny against the mutiny is a bit of a stretch here. They said no, and then surrendered when they knew that it was hopeless. And perhaps if they could not escape, doing so might have given them some bargaining power, which is understandable. Like we've gone over, the fleet were no fans of authority.
After the Kronstadt mutiny failed and its leaders had fled to Finland, they made an agreement to join the White Army of Wrangel. So that is when they reached the absolute pinnacle of their counter-revolutionary treachery. Avrich writes, quote, "In May 1921, Petrichenko and several of his fellow refugees at the Fort Ino camp decided to volunteer their services to General Wrangel in a new campaign to unseat the Bolsheviks and restore, quote-unquote, the gains of the February 1917 revolution," unquote. The Petrichenko gang and the white forces of Wrangel agreed to, quote, the retention of their slogan, "All power to the Soviets but not the parties." The slogan was to be retained only as a, quote-unquote, convenient political maneuver until the communists had been overthrown. Once victory was in hand, the slogan would be shelved and a temporary military dictatorship installed.
Once more, Avrich himself states of the post-revolt links. And he also adds that the last line, hinting at a military dictatorship, was actually most probably meant as a sop for Wrangel. By all means, have a go at them for becoming reactionary. Fuck 'em. But I don't see how it's difficult to understand that when you've been disillusioned from a group that is presenting itself as the monopoly on progress, which enforces this might through strict discipline, then you try to reform it and you fail, and then that group sends bullets flying into your comrades, they get mowed down in front of you, you're losing all hope, you might possibly be of the mindset to regrettably accept the help of whoever was left. This is a highly likely reason why so many dissidents from the former socialist bloc ended up becoming supporters of capitalism, because the Soviets stamped out nearly all attempts at left alternatives. What else are you supposed to do? Yes, I'm sure you'd just love it if they went straight into the line of fire and got chopped down. That would be very convenient for you. Actually, they did you a favor by escaping. It lets you say stuff like this. What this showcases is a flaw in the democratic centralist structure of the party, that it didn't allow for discontent to be channeled through it. When your only proposal is it's our way or the capitalist way, and I have to live under your way, guess what? Sometimes the capitalist way feels like the new punk.
The reactionary mutineers claimed that mass uprisings had broken out in Petrograd and Moscow to support the Kronstadt Mutiny, but this was a complete lie. Even the Menshevik leader Dan admitted in his 1922 book that, quote, the Kronstadt Mutiny was not supported by the Petersburg workers in any way, unquote. So he admits that basically nobody outside Kronstadt supported the mutiny except, reactionaries.
That's a lie. Once more, right after this passage about Peredplenkin, in which Finn spoke about earlier, anarchists across the country were highly supportive, producing their own propaganda and actively trying to galvanize and big up the fleet to those who were uncertain. Still, one might ask why the support from the strikers was not as big as it could have been. Finn states that this support didn't come because it was emblematic of a bunch of reactionaries with no worthwhile agenda. Conveniently ignored is the much more obvious answer: guns. Firstly, the Bolsheviks had a whole propaganda campaign which was used to put down and alienate the recently crushed workers' revolt from the rebels. As said before, they immediately made the claim that the situation was under control of Kozlovsky. The Bolsheviks were making it very clear what would happen if such people sided with the rebels. They locked down the whole city and only special officials were allowed to enter or leave. This was then followed by arrests and crackdowns on gatherings. It's easy to claim that people didn't support a given group when you make it illegal at the threat of death to support them at every turn. Finn tries to use the apparent anarcho-syndicalist workers' opposition as proof that even libertarians didn't support the revolt. I mean, the spokesperson for that particular faction was Alexandra Kollontai, hardly befitting an anarcho-syndicalist, but given that it was an opposition within the government establishment and thereby had stock and sympathy within the Bolshevik cause, it's not particularly too surprising that they would oppose attempts to overthrow them.
Milyukov, one of the capitalist leaders of Russia who was ousted by the October Revolution, wrote in his newspaper, which was published in Paris, that reactionaries need to support the Kronstadt Mutiny. Quote, the capitalist Milyukov supplied the Kronstadt counter-revolutionaries with the watchword, Soviets without communists.
In this section, Finnbol uses three sources to try and push the claim that the sailors wanted Soviets without communists. Let me make it very clear, this was never the slogan of the rebels. The actual slogan was, all power to the Soviets, not the parties. The former is simply a widely propagated lie.
Some anarchists will claim that the Kronstadt sailors must have been like super revolutionaries because they even helped in the October Revolution, and since now there was a mutiny in Kronstadt, well, that must mean that, look, the supposedly best of the revolutionaries now mutinied because they saw how bad the Bolsheviks were. Anarchist historian Avrich writes that the bulk of the Kronstadt sailors currently present when the mutiny took place had actually fought in anti-communist forces before they got there.
I feel Finn is being intentionally deceptive here. There's two statements being made. Some of them had fought with the anti-Bolshevik forces, and the majority of the fleet had been switched up. Finn sneakily combines the two of these together to create the majority of the fleet fought with the anti-Bolshevik forces, even though they are not remotely synonymous.
Old-timers had been replaced by conscripts from the rural districts. By 1921, more than 3/4 of the sailors were of peasant origin, a substantially higher proportion than in 1917, when industrial workers from the Petrograd area made up a sizable part of the fleet.
And once more, Finnbol ignores Avrich's very informative conclusions regarding the makeup of the fleet. I'll let you pause to read, and I suggest you do. Peasants were always a large makeup of the fleet. Russia at this time was undergoing a massive transition from an agrarian system into an industrial one, and as such, calling somebody a worker or a peasant may have been largely synonymous interchangeable for a lot of the population. And something very crucial to bear in mind, because people love to point out the compositional changes to explain why the fleet did what they did. Kronstadt 1921 was not the first mutiny by the fleet, not even the first during the revolution. There had already been a mutiny in 1918, which also included a list of demands and even a possible overthrow of the government. And as you can see, even back then they had their issues with political commissars, hence I state the problem was probably larger than simply wanting to return to the Tsar. And whilst this didn't get off the ground, it occurred during a time in which the fleet could not have been of that different a composition, which completely blows the validity of this Bolshevik argument, because even the original fleet were just as privy to being unruly. So much for the pride and joy of the revolution. Instead of including this afterword, or the context, Finnbol claims that Avrich simply thinks that
doesn't matter.
I mean, that's remarkably bad faith.
Another piece of information indicating that the Kronstadt mutineers did not represent the best revolutionary elements, but actually some of the worst, most politically backward elements, was their rampant antisemitism.
Finnbol pushes the normal antisemitism accusation and even cites Lamanov's Interrogation. The statements are merely anecdotes that we are supposed to just take verbatim, apparently. I've gone over them in my old video. Interestingly, the urine letter is missing. I thought that would have been a pretty big smoking gun for you guys. Now, I've been looking over Kronstadt for some time now, and it's incredible how whenever this is brought up, there's just this abundance of childish smears that are completely uninterested in debating the historical points and just want to live in Wonderland. This behavior seems remarkably similar to the smears used against the Corbyn administration during his last leadership. Not one of genuine concern, but rather an attempt to weaselly quote mine these sources and bump your side, which is frankly juvenile, pathetic behavior, and you should all stop doing it right now and learn a thing or two. And what is the record of that side, might we ask? During the revolution, the Red Army was responsible for over 700 documented deaths resulting from 106 pogroms. That's of course far, far fewer than Petlura's 16,000 deaths, but it's still a surprisingly large amount. And the numbers don't take into account the effect this had on the local populace. And let me make it clear, these are just the documented deaths in what is probably a very conservative figure by Gurgel in 1928. More modern reports, I'd assume, would be much higher. But frankly, I'm not interested in using these quite abundant actions as proof towards the Bolsheviks needing to be crushed and put away, am I? I do not believe that the core of the Bolshevik project was anti-Semitic. Otherwise, we'd have seen much higher ratios. I can happily summarize that these attacks are probably the result of minorities within the army and party, but not supported by the majority of the party themselves, which is more or less the same for Kronstadt. But despite no motions being passed, Finnbol, and plenty of MLs and Trots feel it's sufficient to imply that the rebel movement was anti-Semitic to its core, and or not worthy of respect based on a few anecdotes which they then inflate and smother. The details of these Bolshevik and Red Army anti-Semitic acts have been well researched by Brendan McGeever in his book Antisemitism and the Russian Revolution. He also concludes that the main driver and influencer in opposition towards anti-Semitism came not from the Bolsheviks themselves, but rather from non-Bolshevik-aligned socialist Jews, and that eventual crackdowns on anti-Semitism was not done out of a desire to protect Jews, but rather part of a larger attack on enemies of the regime, controlling the language of politics. Brendan is, by the way, an anti-Zionist who appears to be socialist-aligned, so don't go throwing around reactionary accusations. Interestingly, this book has gone under the radar in discourse, and that's a shame, as it really puts to bed a lot of these slimy double standards which pro-Bolsheviks often put upon their opposition. The final argument that Finn makes is on Trotsky, and this is pretty straightforward. Trotsky might not have been at the battle himself, but he was certainly at Petrograd. He, along with Kamenev, Tukhachevsky, and Lebedev, signed the final warning to the fleet. So this statement that Trotsky makes is basically a lie. He did participate, just with the pen, not with the sword. So, I'm just going to be real here for a second. Nobody should ever claim that the Kronstadt Revolt was an anarchist revolt, nor should they necessarily cling to the event as some sort of unquestionable canon. If the Kronstadt Revolution won, but then simply instituted another system of oppression, albeit maybe slightly better, we ought to oppose that too. As I've gotten older and understood the core foundations of anarchism, the more my dependence on a certain finesse of these events has become less and less necessary. The reason for its strong place amongst anarchist canon is because it represents the final point at which most libertarians realized that the revolution had been lost. Initially, many anarchists were fellow travelers of the Bolsheviks inside and outside of Russia. It's understandable. The first large-scale revolution in their lifetimes, and with rarely any previous precedent of authoritarianism within socialism, who could blame people buying into such a gambit given their conditions? Emma Goldman was famously ecstatic about joining the revolution. By the point of Kronstadt, however, she had changed her tune.
If Bolshevism means the peasants taking the land, the workers taking the factories, Russia's one place where there's no Bolshevism.
The conclusion for analyzing the revolt should never be to say that our side was the best, our side would have definitely created real socialism, but rather that it exposes the nature of the Bolsheviks, the standards they held, and the lengths to which they and their adherents would go in order to defeat relatively soft reformist demands, in how they would spread disinformation, conspiracy, escalate, refuse to negotiate, and eventually crush all resistance. And moreover, that it was not just limited to the spring of 1921. Since then, many people refer to so-called Kronstadt moments, present-day real-life showcases of an ideology in action which led to their disillusionment of Marxist-Leninist beliefs. I don't think I had any specific straw which broke the camel's back. It was a very protracted process for me, but I think if I had to point to a historic event that really got my gears turning, it would probably have been the Hong Kong protests. Where, hoping that I would find some nuanced and enlightening perspectives on this mass discontent, I ended up seeing time and time again just completely irrelevant points alongside a certain aversion to critically think. That they were all just coming from the preconceived standpoint of China is right, China is socialist, defend China at all costs. The extradition bill was legitimized under the pretense of a murder, which apparently justified it being done. Yet if such an event were to have happened in the West, we wouldn't have given a rat's ass about the reasoning for an action that we would immediately understand was being done for much more opportune motives. Instead of explaining the actions of the police, they instead just decided to highlight conservative hypocrisy, ironically ignoring their own. Statements were being made against the protesters that they weren't as peaceful as the media claimed they were. But such pearl-clutching seemed very conservative and contradictory, considering the left-wing analysis of violence in power relations that I had been accustomed with. And today I think back to stuff like the CPUSA response to the Sino-Soviet split, or indeed the way that the Bolsheviks responded to Kronstadt, and how if I were a contemporary of any of these events, I would have had to have believed outright lies. No. That's just not how I am. And all of these things, whilst in their individual form might not mean much, collectively, over time, and with immediacy, they might lead you to question whether this path could ever lead you to the ends that you seek, even at the best of times. Imagine that the Kronstadt Revolt was a full-on anarchist revolt, that there was no anti-Semitism present at all, that they all put forward unequivocal socialist demands, and that they all went down to the bitter end instead of retreating. Would you still believe that the Bolsheviks were right in crushing the revolt? We can always banter around with the nitty-gritty here and there, and that's always fun, but the answer to this more foundational question is yes. Because Marxist-Leninists and Trotskyists always put forward the consolidation of the revolution before anything else, and that any fracture might pose a threat to their power. And that then leads us to ask other questions. The Hungarian Revolution and Prague Spring both happened in a position of far more power and solidity than there ever was during the Civil War, and yet those actions are still put forward as necessary to be crushed for the same reasons. Unless you're a trot. If even at the highest times this argument would still be valid, then what is there that I can say? So the main question lies at the inception and whether we consider those actions valid. Whether we believe that achieving state power would ever lead to the ends that we want. To use a metaphor from American law, the fruit of the poisonous tree. Arguments made to defend the Bolsheviks don't really hold much water if you contend that the tree was unripe from the beginning. At least that's the argument from non-Bolshevik supporting socialists. So perhaps in the future we should settle upon more root questions of ideology instead of the trimmings, which I decided is more useful and intend to do in the future. So, was this entire video basically pointless? In many ways, yeah.